Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. Now, one of the points that was being made right at the start by Nikolai was about misinformation and that increasingly salient problem. But there's all sorts of problems with information in understanding the past, and something which sometimes looks quite simple suddenly has much greater complexity when you interrogate it, and what looks objective might not be so. And this is something we're going to put forward very much to Slobodan, taking the issue of historical maps and showing where they lead us and showing perhaps where they mislead us. So Slobodan, Professor, University of Belgrade, and someone who his expertise in the history of ideas is coming through now. Thank you, Slobodan.
Thank you very much. And of course, special thanks to the CEO Forum for organizing every year these very important gatherings. And I think it goes without saying how important it is to organize meetings of this kind. Can you hear me now? Yes. So, how important it is to have meetings of this kind in a region where we are still faced with the fact that politicians take advantage of using historical narratives. I will speak about historical and geographic maps, but you should be aware that every geographic map after some time becomes historical map. So I'll just give you several examples of how difficult it is to read a map. This, for instance, is a map from the very early 18th century. And as you can see, at the top it's called Europa. But actually it doesn't show Europe, although you could guess this is Europe. And that means that you look at this map from our vantage point, from our point of view. All these maps, of course, were hand-colored. So colors are not important, because this map, this is one of the preserved maps, but every single is colored a little bit differently depending on who colored it. So colors are not important. What is important is that borders were made. And this brings us to the very fact that if we don't know the context, we cannot even read one map. So to us, it looks as a simple map of Europe, but to someone from the early 18th century, this was not a map of Europe, or more precisely, not all of what you see on this map is Europe. So, apart from the fact that it's mentioned, Turkey is mentioned specifically, Poland is mentioned, Muscovite state is mentioned, all of that was understood by the contemporaries not to be Europe in the early 18th century. We may not understand it today. This is because the philosophical geography of Enlightenment defined what was Europe and what was not. And so, just by making borders, the cartographers suggested these parts are not parts of Europe, which of course, if we don't know the context, we cannot understand. Especially if someone does it this way. So for instance, German lands and Central Balkan lands are in the same color. But nonetheless, to the contemporaries, it would be very clear that all these lands of the Balkans, Central Europe, Polish Commonwealth and Muscovite state were not considered to be a part of Europe. The problem is that we know this context, but we don't know every single context. And what intellectual history tells us is that we cannot really reconstruct what people were thinking 200 or 300 years ago. And now it depends which intellectual school of history you use. But if you use, for instance, Cambridge School is very satisfied to identify what were the questions that certain age asked. And if you do that, you will be very close to the spirit of that age, the zeitgeist. but you can never actually reconstruct everything. So we may be missing, we don't know what we are missing, because we have this information, but not other pieces of information that we should have. This is American map from the end of the, I will return to this map several times, and it shows ethnic, national actual composition of Southeast Europe. And there are several things where we can immediately read political messages. For instance, Serbo-Croats are together. There were no Serbo-Croats, of course. There was one member of the young Bosnian movement in Bosnia who in his memoirs wrote that when he came to Sarajevo in the 1910s, so to the Austrian town at that time, Austro-Hungarian town of Sarajevo, he learned that there was a new nation for which no one heard in his family, or no one in his native village, or no one in his native region, and that nation was called Serbo-Croats. So the nation only existed among youth revolutionaries of Sarajevo. Nonetheless, it's listed like Serbo-Croats. Here, and Gavrilo Princip said he was a Serbo-Croat in the trial. So that identity existed, but was very limited to very, very small groups of people. Or, for instance, Bulgarians, they are listed here as Slavo-Mongols, and we can, of course, understand why, because there was propaganda in the Anglosphere against Huns and Mongols. Huns were Germans, and Mongols were other allies of Central Powers. Hungarians were called Huns, but then Turks and Bulgarians would be Mongols. So basically, the Entente was waging war against the coalition of Huns and Mongols. So these are political things. And then you would say, okay, the rest is okay. But very soon, I hope I will show you that actually it is very questionable whether this map gives us any information, relevant information on what was the national composition on the eve of the Great War, or let's say in the early 20th century in the region. The second map is German. Seemingly is more neutral. How about speaking loudly rather than using microphone? Yes, okay. Is this better? Yes, but I don't think that anyone hears me in the background, no?
No, it doesn't work. It's not
Doesn't work.
Maybe to use this microphone.
So also, the closer it is to your mouth, and the less it will be influenced by this.
You can actually have
Well, I can
Speak loud.
to speak louder here and
Yes.
No,
We can hear you.
okay, good.
It's not
Good. So let's take this. Okay, so this is another map, and it shows linguistic divisions. It's a little bit more precise. For instance, Armenian is listed separately than Romanian, etc., which of course could be contested. If you're a Romanian nationalist, you would say no, it's not the same language, but the same or not. Macedonian Slavs are separate, which of course some people in Bulgaria wouldn't like to see, etc. And you have also a map of religious denominations. And actually, this is it's a German map. This is the result of very good German scholarship on the region, which is the best of all the scholarships at that time. And seemingly everything is fine, but now we will see gradually if everything is fine or not. The first thing is the geography is not neutral, and the most famous cases are, of course, continents. And if you take the definition of a continent, the continent is defined as a huge land mass surrounded from all the sides by seas and oceans. And you probably see a problem with Europe. Europe does not satisfy the definition. It's not surrounded by seas and oceans from all the sides. It's because Europe is not a continent. If Europe is a continent, that's fine, but India is a continent then as well, and the Arab Peninsula is a continent, etc. And then there is a seemingly neutral term Eurasia, which of course now has Russian connotations. But let's forget about Russian connotations. Think, although we cannot, but let's try to think only in geographic terms. Why should it be Eurasia? If Asia is 44 million square kilometers and Europe is 10 million, it must be Asia-Europe. Asia-Europe, I don't know how to be. Asia-Europe, Asia-Europe. whatever. Obviously, it cannot be, because we are still Eurocentric. But I'm sure that others, in the same way as Trump did it, will sooner or later say, no, we are not going to call you a continent anymore. We call all of this Asia, or we call it, and that will be it, because the majority of global population, when they start calling it that way, Europeans will sooner or later need to accept that as well. For the time being, there is still Europe. It's like with the planet Pluto. At some point, simply, they will decide Pluto is not a planet, Europe is not a continent. Okay, for the time being, it is. This is a map from 1902, and I just want to show you that what the philosophers of the Enlightenment did in the early 18th century when they defined the confines of Europe, and when they basically equaled the space of the Enlightenment with the confines of Europe, which means that if there were no absolute enlightened monarchs, then that country would not be considered European. So the Ottoman Empire was obviously not European. With Russia, there was a bigger problem because it had enlightened rulers in the 18th century. So from that point of view, it would definitely be European, but still was not considered to be. So essentially, Belgrade was in Asia from the point of view, the first town in Asia from the point of view of the philosophical geography of the Enlightenment, and the easternmost town of Europe was Prague. And this is the remnant of this way of thinking. So David George Hogarth published this book in 1902 called The Nearer East. And this term is not used anymore. But it's not used only in English. It's used in other languages. Not in all. It's used in Russian, it's used in Slavic languages. It's because the East consisted of three parts: the Near East, the Middle East, and the Far East. And of course now you can hear that there is a CNN correspondent from the Middle East, and he or she may report from Jerusalem. But that would be the Near East. Because the Middle East is now the middle to nothing. Well, originally it was the middle because there was the Near East, and that was the Ottoman Empire. Because it was an East, it was Asia. And David George Hogarth just reminded us that he was real, for post-colonial experts, he's an ideal target to analyze. He was director of the British School at Athens, and there was a British School at Athens and in Rome, for colonial institutions. Expert on Hittites, the ancient people of Hittites, and a cartographer. But this book was called Epoch-Making Geography by Roderick Davidson, one of the greatest Orientalists, again a term which we don't use anymore, American Orientalists of the early post-World War II era. Hogarth gave us even more specifically what he meant in the same book. He gave us a graphic description, illustration of what he meant by the Nearer East. So everything black in this map, that's from his book, is the Near East, or Asia. So at that time, it was already Romania. So Romania and Serbia somehow escaped the term Bulgaria as well. It's part of Bulgaria, not the whole Bulgaria. But southern Bulgaria and Greece and Albania, they were still kept within the realm of the East, simply because Hogarth didn't like Greece. He was disappointed. Greece was not advancing as quickly as he wanted Greece to advance, so he decided to punish Greece and put it back to the realm of the East. Byron wouldn't probably agree, but Robert was in charge. So essentially, this shows you that, first of all, that ideas shape geography, and secondly, that once established narrative is very difficult to get rid of. And this idea of whether the Balkans were in the East or in Europe, they were there until the Balkan Wars, basically, until the end of the First World War. After that, it was something else. Now, the first problem with the map that I showed you is it shows nationalities. Let me remind you. It is that nationalism is a process. And nationalism, as every ism is a process, of course, not only nationalism. It has several phases before it has reached the phase of mass mobilization. When you ask people in the censuses, you don't ask them, are you really a Hungarian, or do you feel dominantly as a Hungarian, do you feel slightly? Just ask what are you, they say Hungarian, not thinking in the terms we would think today from the point of view of nationalism studies. So to understand something, we first need to conceptualize it. So before the studies of nationalism appeared, we couldn't even conceptualize what we should look within geographic and historical maps. And when Miroslav Kroch made this theory first in Czech and then more famously in English in the 1980s, first in German and then in English, he delineated these three phases. You have heard of these phases probably, so I will not repeat them. The point is that only in the third phase there is a mass movement, mass mobilization of people. But today we know that even when there is mass mobilization of people in the capitals, it did not necessarily affect villages. Rural areas may have stayed slightly longer outside of the influence of nationalism. You will see that that's not the only problem. Even where, in those cases where we see mass nationalism, it may be episodic. Although, because we are focused on certain historical moments, explosive historical moments, and during those explosive historical moments, definitely there was mass mobilization. So if we read testimonies of what was happening in Vienna, Berlin, or Paris, or Belgrade, versus Belgrade during just before the Balkan Wars, or any actually Balkan Orthodox capital before in the early stages of the First Balkan War, or European capitals during the July crisis, in the days at the end of the July crisis, when the war was already coming, you see that there was nationalist euphoria in Paris, in Berlin, in Vienna, even in London. Don't forget that the government was neutral, in a sense, pacifist government, liberal government, and that government actually preferred to stay out of war. It preferred to violate international treaty that Britain had with Belgium, but the public opinion forced them to enter the war. So this is what popular appeal may bring. They actually acted as Eric would suggest. They decided to go to war. That was what the nation requested. But these moments confuse us because they give us a wrong opinion. First of all, that kind of mood existed everywhere. And secondly, that kind of mood was employed every single day. We will now see examples that show different kinds of suggestions. But let me first give some findings of the studies of nationalism for our region, Southeast Europe. First of all, in the mid-19th century, ethnic groups in the region were not far from their ethno-religious identity. So in many parts of the Balkans in the mid-19th century, people would, if you ask them, where are you from, they would tell you their local identity. I'm from that and that region, rather than from that and that country. In some cases, they couldn't even say they were from any country because they lived in the Ottoman Empire. And they certainly wouldn't say we are from the Ottoman Empire. They didn't have the notion, that kind of notion. The Christian population didn't have it. But in around 1900, at least Balkan capitals were fully nationalized, to the point of view that Mark Mezauer says in his book on Salonika that the war, the First Balkan War, looked as if nations were waging the war, not the armies. But this captivating description, which actually we find in the sources, describes euphoria of a part of the armies, certainly of officers, of many urban soldiers, but not necessarily of the whole armies, as we will see soon. So when we return back to this map, we now know that this map, there's something wrong about it. Because Romanians, all who are blue here, or Serbo-Croats, or who are green, they were at different levels. Actually, many of them would not even call themselves by any of those names, either Serbs or Croats at that time, or whatever Bosnian Muslims would have called themselves at that time, because they're included here under that name. Nonetheless, census recorded them that way. And we will later see, from comparisons between sociology and history, that what census actually misses the note. Second problem is that some ethnic and linguistic groups remained for many decades immune to nationalist appeal. And of course, you have the case here, settlers in Transylvania, which became the symbol of Hungary a few days ago during the opening of the parliament, but actually for many, many decades, they were the symbol of indifferentism. Tuteji, which means in whatever you would call the local language, locals, people from here, in former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Istrians in Istria, Slavic Macedonians in Macedonia, Upper Silesians, Romaic Romans, and I will give you now concrete examples of some of them to explain what this meant. First of all, to go to Tara Zara, who is the canonizer of this idea of indifferentism. She explains why indifferentism was not visible. It was not visible because indifferentism was described by different names. So it's in the sources. People described it. Travel writers described it. Political activists described it. Even ordinary people described it in their diaries. Just they used different names. So they noticed that there were populations which did not identify with the mainstream of national propaganda. But some of them called them, they are regionalists, they are cosmopolitans, they are Catholics, in negative sense. They are socialists, they are locals, they are bilingual people, but with stress, bilingual people. That's something we should be afraid of. They are people who actually are involved in intermarriages. They are opportunists. They are immoral people, backward people, stubborn people, people with false consciousness. So now we need to reread all these sources to establish, to see if they all come under this category or not, or who of them come. Now, national indifferentism does not imply that there were no identities. I need to be very clear about that. Identities are always there. They are among traditional societies. If you're in Paleolithic, there are about tribes and bands. There is always some identity. It only implies that in pre-modern, but also in modern era, some other types of identities existed or coexisted with dominant identities. And concomitantly with national indifferentism, there are also dual and multiple national identities, which by Tara-Zara definition also come within this definition, but I will separate the two. So, as she puts it, indifference to nationalism actually flourished in the eye of the nationalist storm in Europe between 1880 and 1948. And this is important, this is the period which Hobsbawm defines as the apogee of nationalism. So even in the apogee of nationalism, not only in the 19th century, even during the apogee of nationalism, indifferentism existed. And Tara-Zara, she puts under this term two things: non-national and nationally ambivalent populations. I would, I agree that we could put both, but I will separate them. So I will first say something about non-national and then something about multiple identities. First of all, what I would like to say is that every single person in nascent nation states and also in well-framed nation states stands at some point within a continuum between homogeneity and indifference. So even people who are very nationalistic do not need to be 100% nationalistic. And even people who look very indifferent are not 100% indifferent. It's a continuum. And importantly, we move along that continuum ourselves, no matter what we opt for, like with any other identity. So the problem is it's not only intergroup or interpersonal problem in analysis, it's also the problem of our fluid selves. We don't anymore see selves as something that is coherent. In psychology, we increasingly see selves, the self, the notion of self as something fluid. So for modern theoreticians of the self, this is not a problem. Earlier, that would be a problem because people somehow wanted to make things that are not coherent very coherent. So let's give several cases. This is the first case. The case of Upper Silesians, who, as you see from the title, were neither Germans nor Poles, and they are considered as the most famous indifferent population in 20th century Central Europe. And there is this description in 1906, which Father Jan Kapitsa posed as a question. What is an Upper Silesian? Is he a German, a Pole, a Prussian, simply an Upper Silesian? A colleague of mine is doing a PhD on Tuteji, and he collected all possible testimonies when they were asked. And you have hundreds of statements like this. We are neither Polish, nor Belarusian, nor this, nor that. How did this happen? Well, local priests were largely nationally indifferent, and that prevented nationalizations in either way, to become Poles or to become Germans. And why is this so important? Because usually many people think that indifferentism is pre-modern and nationalism is modern. But there is a problem here. This is one of the most modernized areas in Europe. So in one of the most modernized areas in Europe, one which according to Eugene Weber, who explained us how the peasants became Frenchmen, but everything that helped, or most of things except the church, but all other things that helped peasants to become Frenchmen in France were here, but they didn't work. So this region at the turn of the 20th century had near universal literacy, widespread industrialization, and a vibrant associational culture. So it should have been nationalized, but it wasn't. That's one case. So it's not only about being pre-modern, modern, postmodern, whatever. The second thing is from here, of course, from Cluj, the famous book by Rogers Brubaker and Associates. He analyzed dynamics of nationalism in post-communist Cluj. And as you know, the local situation was very close to an open inter-ethnic conflict at some point. There was a highly ethnicized rhetoric centered around the main square in Cluj, and the statue of Matthias Corvinus and column of Trajanus, etc. You know all those things better than me. But in spite of all of this, Brubaker, who made local interviews, spoke with the people, he concluded most Hungarians, like most Romanians, are largely indifferent to politics and preoccupied with problems of everyday life. And they don't interpret these things in ethnic terms. So you have elite, the mayor, who produces ethnic narratives, but it doesn't necessarily affect people in everyday life. So it means that nationalization of elite politics did not translate automatically into polarization of everyday life. Or, as Brubaker put it, for most Clujeni, I suppose it's pronounced that way, even for most Hungarians, the everyday experience of ethnicity had been largely independent of what Funar, the mayor, said and did as mayor, at least during his second and third terms, when Clujeni had grown to his provocations. So essentially, elite politics and everyday life can also differ. You will not see it in any map. Because all the people say, I'm Hungarian, I'm Romanian, this and that. But what does that mean? To them is very different depending on who you ask. The problem is that only sociologists and anthropologists ask that question. And the census maker do not. And the nation state does not want to ask that question. Because that would undermine the nation state immediately. And now let me give you the most obvious example, my favorite example from Macedonia. This is the book by Noel Brailsford from 1906. Noel Brailsford was a correspondent of the Daily Telegraph and the Red Cross activist at that time. So he was stationed in Salonika. And this is the beginning of the 20th century, just be reminded that climate was very different, much cooler than today. Which means, and that was of course something very important for the Ottoman Empire throughout its operations in the Balkans. You don't go to any military operations between September and March, September and April, simply because valleys are blocked. Because if you need to pass through any mountainous region to valley, and if that region is under snow, you will not be able to do it. This essentially means that you are a Red Cross activist. You will bring humanitarian supplies in April, May to the hinterland. You will distribute them and will return in September. So Brailsford was doing this for 3 years, going to hinterland and back. And after 3 such tours, he visited the same villages several times. So now we know this is not Brailsford statistics. This is statistics from the Encyclopedia Britannica. So Brailsford could have read it just after he published his book 5 years later. Nation states that already existed, or almost nation states, because in line with what I said, I doubt that Serbia, Romania, and Greece were really nation states, but they were, at least in their capitals. So people from the capitals, from the ministries of education, culture, and from the governments in Belgrade, Bucharest, and Athens, they said, Macedonia is still Ottoman, so who is going to have it? Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, or There are no Romanian schools, sorry, but there were also Romanian schools. I omitted to add schools in Romanian. So all the four states said, this is a very good chance to turn Macedonia into being exclusively Serbian, exclusively Bulgarian, exclusively Greek, or exclusively Romanian or Armenian. It was a little bit more difficult, but then at least to have Romanian influence there. And as you can see, Serbs were lagging behind. They started their propaganda a little bit later, so Greeks and Bulgarians did it better. Which means that they were sending to all those schools not only teachers, but also priests to those villages, because the Orthodox churches were ethnified at that moment as well. Not the great church in Constantinople, but the local churches controlled from Belgrade, Sofia, and from Athens as well, Archbishopric of Athens. And the problem is these local churches had different idea on what Orthodox believers should be than the mother church or the great church in Constantinople. The great church in Constantinople still believed that they should all be Romaic Romans who have local ethnicities. But local churches said, no, we are Bulgarian Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. So now Bracefold is in the middle of that campaign, and he goes to the same villages 6 times. 3 times there, 3 times back. And he asked people, who are you? And suddenly he realizes something very specific. Fathers who had themselves as Greeks brought into the world Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Romanian children. Of course, the problem is with English language, because it doesn't distinguish between Greek and Romaic. When you say Romaic, it doesn't mean anything in English. I'm just using it as a technical term. So they were not Greeks, they were Romei, but we can't translate it. Romans, they were Romans, if you want. Eastern Romans. Okay, so fathers were Eastern Romans and called themselves Romei, but their children, at the time when Brailsford was there, called themselves either Romei or Hellenes, Romei or Hellen, or Serbs or Bulgarians or Romanians or Armenians. How was this possible? So he comes at some point to a village because he had notes, and he's confused. This was a Greek village, now it's Bulgarian. So he says, is this a Greek or a Bulgarian village? He asks the locals, and they tell him, well, it is Bulgarian now, but 4 years ago it was Greek. Oh, he's now totally confused. He wants to know the answer, and he asks the people, and people tell him, because people are, very open at that point. And they say, look, first we had a Greek priest and he told us we were Greeks. But then Bulgaria said you would have priests paid by the Greek state, by the Bulgarian state, and teacher paid by the Bulgarian state. So you don't need to pay anything. Just need to say you're Bulgarians. And we have a similar testimony from Ivan Meštrović, which I will not now quote because I don't have time, but he describes one Bulgarian diplomat in Rome, Bulgarian diplomatic representative, and they discuss whether Macedonia is Serbian or Bulgarian. And Ivan Meštrović, who is a Croat, but a Yugoslav nationalist, and who comes from Dalmatia, and in Dalmatia, Kosovo cycle, the songs of the Kosovo cycle were equally present among Serbs and Croats, among Orthodox and Catholic population, including the village of Meštrović. So Meštrović knows everything about Serbian medieval hero, King Marko. And because King Marko was in Prilep, and Prilep is in Macedonia, he thinks that Macedonia should be Serbian. But the Bulgarian diplomat tells him, you can keep King Marko, just give us Macedonia. Take King Marko if you want. But he said, I was a Serb, and my best friend is now minister in Belgrade, and we went to the same school. School was Serbian. But then I was given a stipend in Sofia, and he was given a stipend in Belgrade. So he is now Minister of Finances in Belgrade, and I am now diplomatic representative of Bulgaria in Rome. So at that time, changes of this kind were not unusual. So if we go back here, we suddenly realize that we should have a little bit different colors for settlers, Macedonian Slavs, Istrians. I'm not sure we see Upper Silesians, we almost see them, but okay. Tutejši maybe we see slightly. They shouldn't be in the same color like others, because they didn't experience that the same way. And now, this is the map of the Balkan Peninsula, in the way as Yugoslav and Serbian geographer Jovan Cvic defined it. As you can see, he excluded Romania from the Balkan Peninsula. Romania is a part of every history of the Balkans, and that's why we always need, whoever writes history of the Balkans must explain in the first paragraph, in spite of the fact that Romania is not a part of the Balkans, blah, 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 blah. Of course, one part of Romania, very small, is part of the delta, but excluding that, not. So this is the Balkans defined by Cvic, and this definition is more or less accepted. But then, this is a part of his famous book, The Balkan Peninsula, published in Paris in 1917 in French, and it was a standard book for decades on the Balkan Peninsula. It also includes something that Cvic called the zones of civilization. Now, this map which I showed you is the map that similar maps Cvic took to Paris to claim territories for Yugoslavia. It means basically that Cvic claimed all these people are Serbs. Whoever said, he didn't have this idea that we have today. People were in different phases, no matter whether they were in tribal or in organization, or whether they lived in copies of European cities like Bucharest, which is Balkan Paris, or some other copy of European cities in the Balkans. All of them were the same. They were the Serbs, whether they live in Belgrade or whether they were shepherds somewhere, or they were Bulgarians or Romanians or whatever. But the problem is that Cvic's book itself shows that that was not the case. So Cvic himself published this map as well. And this map shows everything white in the Balkans, so disregard Austria-Hungary, everything white in the Balkans was called by Cvic zones of patriarchal civilization. And zones of patriarchal civilization suggested that in these areas, people lived the same way as they lived in the Neolithic times, as Stojanovic, later Balkanologist, rephrased it. So there were no road networks. Illiteracy was almost non-existent. Literacy, was almost non-existent. Illiteracy was almost omnipresent. And pastoralism dominated. This is not to say that in the yellow region, which is like Byzantine, was very different, but at least some elements of Byzantine civilization were felt. That's what at least Cvic believed so. Now, Cvic published this in English as well. This is French and Serbian version. And for American readers, it was simplified. So here, and here you see it perfectly, all those green areas around the Danube, they're the zones where Central Europe made an impact. And speaking of nationalism, we could suggest these are the areas where by the beginning of the First World War, this propaganda was more solidly entrenched than elsewhere. And the same applies to Bulgaria and Albania, Montenegro, Bosnia. But these white areas, without literacy, without road networks, it's contrary to anything that we know. You cannot reach C phase without that. As you can see, you can have modernity and not reach C phase. But to reach C phase, you have to have modernity. And this is this simplified version in which everything was put green, both what is, so this is, no, this is not patriarchal zone, of course. It's a simplified version. But in this area, you could hardly expect mass nationalism. In other areas also is debatable, but in this, definitely not. So he himself gave a proof that what he suggested at the Paris Peace Treaty was not really the case. There were not millions of people who would be ready to, who were dying by their own will. They were dying because they were enlisted to conscript armies. But we have reasons to believe that had they really been able to answer the populist appeal, as Eric suggested, many of them wouldn't go to war at all. So now we come to plural identities. In addition to all of that, in addition to the fact that they're in different areas, in addition to the fact that there are areas with different phases of nationalism, there is also a plural identity. It is a multiple identity, which may be the result of political considerations or simply of historical circumstances. And here is important to mention, we know that identity has to deal with emotions. We know that in these massive explosions of nationalistic rage, we have emotional outbursts. And this is what is visible. But identity is also situational. That is very important, something that we miss. Not everyone. Eric wrote an article in Bunjevci group, which actually shows that political circumstances are very important. So this is one of the definitions of plural identity from a modern author, David Macron. And he actually speaks about Scots and Quebecois Canadians. And he says one important aspect of that is how people articulate their sense of national identity. Scots are also British, the Catalans are Spanish, and Quebecois Canadian when it suits them to be. This plural identity is a political resource which is played in appropriate circumstances rather than a fixed characteristic. While it is true that people in Scotland are more than 6 times more likely to emphasize their Scottishness over their Britishness, it remains the case that just as many claim to be British in some form or another, which you could see at the elections a few days ago. Because, again, the Scottish National Party did not win absolute majority. And it's even less if you take into account the winner takes it all system in Britain. It's even less in terms of popular votes. So essentially, people also may decide, I'm going to be British for this purpose and I'm going to be Scottish for this purpose. And actually Eric has an article on Bunjevci group, who also may decide to be whatever they want, Hungarian or Serb, or Bunjevci, or Serb Catholics, or Croat Catholics, or whatever. And not necessarily would that be only emotionally linked, but could have political considerations. And Macron explains there is no inconsistency in this, for it is a matter of having different identity cards to hand as and when they need to be played. In short, there is something quite calculative about national identity, which shifts according to the political circumstances. It is far less a matter of sentiment than it is a political practice. I wouldn't agree, but I would agree that sometimes it is. That's, I think, everyone would agree, even those who emphasize psychological. I emphasize psychological elements, but I must recognize that this element exists as well. Now, let us give another example. These are the martyrs of Arad, famous to you, of course, the 13 martyrs of Arad. Very important for the Hungarian national consciousness. So the tragic victims of Vilagos. And there is a monument. There are two monuments, Romanian and Hungarian. But I will focus on the Hungarian. How many of them are ethnic Hungarians? 3 to 5, we believe. Then several were of German descent. One was Austrian. 2 were Armenian. The greatest hero was a Serb. And one, we cannot decide whether he was a Croat or Serbo-Croat or whatever. But they are all heroes of the Hungarian Revolution. There is no doubt that every single of them fought for Hungary, accepted Hungary, and at the same time many of them kept, we know for Jovo Damjanic, that he felt both. He was a Serb, he's the greatest hero of all of them there. But we know that he also was Hungarian. And we know that ethnic groups got divided. Serbs were fighting for the empire. They were officially emperor's army, paid by the emperor to fight for him. But nonetheless, we know that at least 2 prominent Serbs, one is here, the other is Jakov Ignjatović, they opted for Hungarians. And one of them is one of the greatest Serbian writers.
More, it was even a bit
Retired. So, they opted for both. So for some of them, there was no problem to be Serbs and Hungarians at the same time, no matter what Pötöfi told them, who was, by the way, of Serbian origin and who insulted them. So there are dual identities, that's what I want to say, and they can work. Even in highly nationalized atmosphere like this one. And I will now give you 2 examples from Belgrade. They are about a group which is very akin to Romanians, Aromenians, or Tsinsars, or they would use a little bit different name for themselves, but doesn't matter. And one of them, the first guy, is the first diplomat of Serbia, and the second is one of the greatest writers ever. So the first was called, in Greek, Petros Itskos, in Aromenian, or Tsinsar, Petar Ichko. In Serbian, Petar Ichko, almost the same. And we know him today as Petar Ichko. He didn't need to change his name. He kept his Aromenian name. He himself would either say that he was a Serb or that he was a Greek. In reality, he was Aromenian. And we know that Aromenians, for a very long time, Tsinsars, as they're called in Serbia, called themselves privately Aromenians, Armani, Armanieshk, but publicly they would call themselves Greeks, Romani actually. What is important here, he's from the early phase of nationalism, so he didn't need to change his name. He could be Serbian hero with Aromenian name and family name, actually name is Christian, so it doesn't matter, family name. He didn't need to change that name. And we have House of Petar Ichko, etc., and he's celebrated, and his street and everything. But the other guy, he was born later, nationalism is already entering the C phase. So he was born as Alkiviadis Nusas. So we see that his family name is Armenian as well. His name is obviously Greek, because there was Hellenization, not Romaic, Eastern Romanization, which was before of Armenians, but Hellenization at this time. But he had also Tsinsar name, which we can spell in Armanieshko in Romanian, so it's Alkiviadi Alnusha or Alkiviadi Alunusha. But he had to change his name. He had to become Branislav and to change a little bit his surname to Nušić to become the greatest Serbian comediographer of all times. And he actually became very open Serbian patriot and very open Yugoslav patriot, as did Armenians anywhere where they lived. In Belgrade, they were the greatest Serbian patriots. In Bucharest, Romania, and in Sofia, Bulgaria, and in Athens, obviously Greek. So for this group, there was no problem to say originally whatever they wanted. We are Greeks, we are Cincers, we are Serbs. But at some point, when C-phase came, they had to opt, and they opted for the most widespread local identity. This is why, if we make a map, and this shows very easily, of identities in the mid-19th century, and say this is where Serbs live, this is not really the case. We don't know. To be very exact, Eric always warns me that we don't know. I acknowledge that we don't know what is prints about this. But then we should acknowledge we don't know. We don't have sufficient data. Finally, should censuses be taken literally? How should we contextualize censuses? Because most of these maps are made, especially German maps. Germans were very accurate. Their scholars were known for it before the First World War. They criticized others for not being as accurate as they were. So they use censuses. But are data from censuses really, what do they mean? And I will give you an example. In Yugoslavia, you couldn't have religious affiliation in the censuses during socialism. And then finally you could in 91. So in the year of 1991, people were asked in all of Yugoslavia, to what religion do you belong? So in Serbia and Central Vojvodina, because Kosovo boycotted, Albanians in Kosovo boycotted that census. So I will simply not mention Kosovo, Central Serbia and Vojvodina. 92.3% declared religious identification, declared religiously. So they were asked, what religion do you belong? 92.3% said, I'm Orthodox, I'm Catholic, Roman Catholic, I'm Muslim, or I'm Protestant, or I'm Jew. 0.1 said, I do not belong to any religion. 2.1 said, I'm not a believer. And 5.5% are unknown. Probably Gastarbeiter families and things like that. Now, almost at the same time, slightly before the census, consortium of Yugoslav institutes of social sciences did a survey on such a huge sample we wouldn't be able to finance it today, 20,000 people or something. There were 5,000 Serbs among them. And they were asked, they were given a scale to, so this is continuum now, what I was suggesting. This is not like, are you Orthodox? I'm Orthodox. Okay? We will see whether it means anything at all. So, they ask people, are you convinced believer? Convinced believer. Convinced believer. It's Freudian slip. People would say that I have something against religion. Maybe, but I hope not. So, convinced believer, 8.5% only. I am a believer, but I do not accept everything that my religion teaches us. 6.2. I'm not sure if I believe or not. This is, there is something like vampires, werewolves, or whatever. 13%. I'm indifferent to religion, 11%. I'm not religious, but I don't have anything against religion, 47.2. And I'm not religious, and I'm opponent of religion, 3.4. So 7 times more of those who hate religion than atheists, because atheists were 0.5 in the same census. So now, look at this. No, sorry, 2.1. Now, 0.5 were in 2011. Now, calculate this. I'm not religious, I'm opponent of religion, I'm indifferent to religion. There are these three groups. That's more than 60%. All of them definitely do not believe. We don't know for those who are not sure. Okay, they can be here or there. So at least 60% do not believe. But 92% of them said, I'm Orthodox, I'm this, I'm that. And this is about identity. Because when they said I'm Orthodox, they didn't declare only their religious identity. Their religious identity was also their ethnic, national, who knows what other identity. So it's not that the map, which I originally showed you, which shows different religions, is not correct. Just the question, what does it suggest? And that is the map from the period of the Balkan Wars. Or any map from 1991, which would give you colors based on the census. So what if we change the census sheet? And not we say, okay, you can express double or multiple identity. For instance, we have it. There are people, a lot of people in Serbia and Montenegro who say, I am a Serbo-Montenegrin or I'm a Montenegrin Serb. But there is an explanation in the census. If you express double or triple or quadruple identity, you will be attributed to the group on the basis of the first mentioned ethnicity. So if you say, I am Serbo-Greek, Serbo-Armenian Greek, you will be Serb. If you're Armenian Serb Greek, you will be Armenian Serb. If you're European Serb, you will be nothing, because there is no European. You will be placed to others. If you're Serb European, you will be a Serb. And imagine if we ask also the people during the census, how much does religious or national identity mean to you? What if majority doesn't mean a lot to me, but I say that I'm that? It's a different type of understanding that we'll have than before that. Or how attached are you to your local, regional, national, supranational identity? We did it with the students who participate in student protests, and they show very huge identification with our full identities. So you can be, it is also multiple identity. I am Clujani, I am Transylvanian, I am Romanian, I am European, I am cosmopolitan. You would get such an answer in that generation, almost certainly. So, now, let me suggest a new map. That map should include regional variations, local identities, differences between commitments and indifferences, and zones of multiple identities. Because we cannot put it in one map, it would need to be three-dimensional. I'm afraid, because I was thinking how to do it. It's impossible to do it. But if we do three-dimensional, it could be achieved. So something to think about. Maybe in one of the future workshops, we could do it from Transylvania. Because for Transylvania, we have more data than for some other areas. And finally, I would like to say, why is this all important? It's because the Gen Z shows all these elements much more than any previous generation. It is the most permissive generation, and being the most permissive means that they don't have problems. Other people also had triple identities, but they wouldn't say it. Members of the Z generation would say it without problem. They don't have a problem to say, I am American, I am Oregonian, I am this and that. They are really against violence. They easily express those identities because Netflix produces these multiple identities, among other things. And they are described as a generation having inclusive heterogeneity, which is more present than ever before. And of course, the most obvious case is when you ask Gen Z people, would you fight for your country? In Europe, most of them say no, most notoriously in Germany, Italy, and some other countries. Not in Sweden, for instance. But, and here is the main point, identity did not disappear. It got transformed because parallelly with this Eurobarometer is done, and people were asked in all these countries, does attachment to your country in the EU means to you? 91% said yes. So obviously, people who are attached to their countries, they're not ready to die for their countries. That's different. This is not C phase of nationalism. This is something new. Patriotism is still there, but it has been redefined. And censuses are still the old. They were made to tell us at the stage when we had conscript armies how many people we could conscript easily and do with them whatever nation, state or empire wanted to do. So the Gen Z demands new maps, and that's my final point of identity, not the ones we were doing. Post-colonial maps. How many crimes did Europeans make between 1900 and 1910 on the world map? Show us for every country in the world. Maps of sexual freedoms. Maps where marijuana is legal, and ecological maps. So this is for what is happening now. Historical maps should be all the same, just instead of is, you should put was. Where was marijuana legal 50 years ago? How did ecology look like 50 years ago? Where was gay relationship legal 50 years ago? Where were those and those crimes committed? So these are totally new maps, not the maps that we use. And unless we start to make such maps, and if we keep being focused on these maps of national, religious, and other identities, I'm afraid that the discipline will lose its appeal to the Z generation. And so I would suggest dealing with these new maps, and if we opt to deal, we from the old school who are interested to include all those identities, I'm not sure that Z generation will be interested, then we should try to make a three-dimensional maps, which will be very different from those maps that I have shown you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Slobodan. So much to think about there. Now, we're going to have to push the time boundaries a little bit here, but I think we must just have any burning questions from the group before we go to our scheduled break. So, I think there was going to be one on Greenland, for instance.
What about Greenland?
What about Greenland?
Does it belong to Europe? What is it? How do we think of it in a three-dimensional way?
Well, we have actually here our colleague Valor coming, who is really an expert, who is an Icelandic expert, top expert on our Arctic security, but also on Icelandic identity. Yes, it's a good question, but the question is actually broader. Is Canada a European state? So you will have a redefinition in the next several months. You will have referendum on, I think, 20th of August in Iceland. Norway may have referendum again. Canada may become associated member of the EU in one way or another. So depending on that, Greenland will be more or less European. So yes, I think it all depends on how antagonistic America will, the United States will be. The more of Trump, the more these countries will become European. So Trump is a great producer of European identity, I would say, in Canada, Greenland, Iceland, and Norway, at least. So he may become super European, at the end, in retrospective.
That point is so important, isn't it, about what conflict or perceived conflict could do in forging identity. I imagine we could pretty strongly assert that Ukrainian identity has changed in the last few years under the onslaught.
Absolutely. Until 2014, Russia was the most popular foreign country in Ukraine. So it's changed dramatically.
Yeah. Well, one other thing on the Greenland point, I noticed that Greenland featured in a wonderfully distorted way in your first map.
Absolutely, yes. Greenland, as you know, because of this, the way how we put it, it looks much bigger than it really is. And but yes, Greenland is only at some points 500 kilometers away from Iceland. So if Iceland becomes a part of the EU, this question will immediately rise. Where is Greenland? And Greenland, as you know, left actually. It could have been a part, but decided not to be.
Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question regarding the Gen Z maps, or how would we make or approach making one? Because I don't know if you're familiar, but the recent studies show that men and women in Gen Z generation have oppositely different opinions. So men are more conservative, while women are more liberal or left leaning. So and I've looked at the other maps because I was interested in how that was in the previous generations, and then around the Gen X that's started to change. Basically, women were more conservative up until the one point, and then from the Gen X, it started to be a wider and wider divide, and it's now even more prominent. So, how would we, should we, and would we take into consideration these different, almost some would say, but very polarizing opinions from male and the female part of the generation?
It depends on what element you take. For instance, Eric sent me the latest survey, which shows that is it 91% of Gen Z would vote for the Democratic Party. 83%, yeah. So it's obviously it must include both genders. To have 83, you can't have with one gender. So they would vote Democratic in the election. So. In the United States now. So it depends also about permissiveness. I didn't see a huge difference, but there can be, it depends what set of questions you ask. So, for instance, Generation Z, they also show greater disapproval of not being loyal to your partner, which we generally would say it's liberal conservative. It's not. It is a matter of context. You must ask them, what does that mean? I myself made a huge mistake when we were doing the first survey with they were still millennials back then in 2016. And we asked them, do you participate in social movements? And they said yes. Are you politically active? No. Are you a member of a political party? No. Do you take part in rallies? No. How do you participate in social movement? And their reply was, we click, we like. And our comment was, this is stupidity. But then you all know about Twitter dismissals. You all know about cancels. You all know about campaigns, internet campaigns against certain producers, etc. If you can influence sales of a product by cancels and likes and dislikes, it means we were wrong. Yes, likes and dislikes, they change the world. Just we didn't realize that. So. The problem is, sociologists who do that, they are still thinking in terms of the previous generation. I'm really not sure about that. So I will look at it. I didn't see in the sets of data I used. I didn't see that huge discrepancy. If there is, it would be interesting to analyze it, but. I didn't see in my samples we did also with student movement, we didn't see any significant difference. We noticed differences between people studying social sciences and other sciences. And we noticed something, I must tell you why I'm more and more skeptical, also even about sociological, I should add. Okay, I expressed my skepticism about censuses. But if some students asked us, what does it mean to be agnostic? And we had to explain. Then what does it mean to ask in a census, general population, are you agnostic? If students do not know what it is like asking them, are you in favor of exploration of other galaxies, or I don't know, whatever. It's totally irrelevant. They don't know what you ask them. So, it's very important when you ask the question that everyone understands what it is. So, also about surveys, we should be, but As I said, I didn't notice this huge difference. I will look into it. So thank you for
Thank
turning
you.
my attention.
There, and finally, Eric. Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned the Romanians, but I didn't hear any mention of the Timok blacks, and I was going to ask because they're very similar, I think, to the Silesians, the Kashubians, that sort of thing. How do you see them as a sort of group? Do you see them as part of the larger Romanian sphere? Are they closer to the Serbs? Are they?
I think they're the same group, ethnically speaking, like Romanians, but they were indifferent, obviously, in the 19th century. 90% of them were Serbianized. And currently, there is not really any effort, because it's a very small group now, there is not really any effort to Serbianize the rest of them. They have double identity. They are Vlachs, or triple, because some of them now also see themselves as Romanians. Had they lived within the boundaries of the Kingdom of Romania, they would become Romanians, definitely, but they didn't live, that's the main point. Vlachs in northern Greece are actually the only minority which Greek nationalism can digest, because they are Vlachs and Greeks at the same time, so Greeks have no problem with that. They had problems because there were some events during the Second World War, etc., but not anymore. So within Orthodox continuum, it was very easy to change. This is very important. This is not unlimited. I didn't speak about that. Only within this Orthodox Commonwealth you could change whatever you wanted. So you had another group which is unknown in Romania. These were Vlachs also, but Vlachs from Romania, from one river island which belonged to Romania, to Wallachia, not to Serbia, so it was before Romanian unification. And Prince Miloš accepted them. And they went to a village called Miloševac, named after him. And then the census came and they asked them, who are you? They didn't speak Serbian, they spoke only Vlach or Romanian. And they said, we are Serbs. And the guy who was doing census, you're not Serbs, you don't speak Serbian. And they said, we are Serbs. No, you're Vlachs. And they said, no, Vlachs are serfs. We are free. So for them, being Serb simply meant in Serbia, the moment they pass the border, there is no feudalism. So the moment they are on the other side, they are free. So that was for them, being Serb was social identification, not ethnic. So we should be careful that these terms mean different things for different people. I should add that during the early socialism, there was a campaign against Vlachs, not to say that they were Vlachs. That was in 1950s, 60s, etc., but not anymore. No one is really very much focused on it. So essentially, from the point of view of these Romanian parties that want to turn Vlach into Romanians, there is no problem. Nobody would, whether they're Romanians or Vlachs, it's all the same for the Serbs. But Serbian state cannot turn them into Romanians. That's the problem. Because if Serbian state tried to do it, there would be Council of Europe's mission sent to Serbia, because they have their own Vlach organizations, and they would say, you are prohibiting us to say that way. The same with Bunjevac. A group of Bunjevac say, we are Bunjevci. A group says, we are Serbs. A group says, we are Croats. There is nothing you can do. As long as one part says, we are Bunjevac, you cannot deny them the right to say, we are Bunjevac. And it's the same with the Vlachs in Timok Valley. You cannot deny them that right, because the Council of Europe would act against Serbia. But because there is no really any particular clash between Serbian and Romanian nationalism, in that sense, nobody really has an action against them, in a sense. So there are Romanian organizations now in Timok Valley trying to convince them, you're Romanians, you're Romanians. So we will see what will happen. But I personally think it's too late to do that. But who knows? Maybe it's not. It's the same with the Bulgarian minority. Some people have local identity, some have Bulgarian. So all these groups that stayed outside of the mother country, to put it that way, although we use today's terminology and implement it back, they developed specific local identity, and Timok Laks are only one of such groups. But there are such groups of Laks scattered all around the Balkans, and Timok Laks are only one of them.
So well done. Thank you. Last question. We've got to be quick on this as well.
Okay. Two points, and then maybe you react, maybe you won't. One is this great sexual dimorphism between sexes amongst humans. I mean, we have sexual dimorphism, but that we also have sexual dimorphism in attitudes for certain, and we've seen that since the 1950s, at least, when, particularly in sexual attitudes, when the Kinsey reports came out and talked about, in detail, American sexuality, and one of the questions the Kinsey reports ask year after year after year of men and women, young single men and women, they concentrate on every sexual category you can imagine. So it's single, heterosexual men and women, and they ask them, how many partners did you have in the last year? And the men's number is here. And the women's number is here. Statistically, this is impossible. Somebody's lying, and they've been lying for decades. The numbers are coming closer, but they're still apart. It's impossible. It's impossible that one guy had, or 50 guys had sex with one girl, and then that's it. It's impossible. It's simply impossible. They're lying. Are the girls lying? Are the men lying? I think the men are lying in the modern world, but they're lying. The numbers, nobody wants, in the modern world, nobody wants to say zero. Nobody. In Gen Z, nobody wants to say zero. That's the thing. So, you find similar lying about, we're not lying.
Eric, we are going to have to play
Okay,
closer.
I'll stop. Okay.
I agree. Yes, that's the problem with sociology, because you rely on the answers, and you must have additional questions to check them. Absolutely, I agree.
Okay, thank you very much once again. Okay, everybody, we'll break for 20 minutes. Could we be back at 4:50? Thank you very much.